April 30th, 1975. The sky over Saigon was thick with smoke and the deafening roar of helicopters. I stood on a rooftop, watching the last Americans scramble onto a Huey, its blades slicing through the humid air. Below me, thousands of people screamed, pushed, begged for a way out. I was 28 years old. I was a journalist, and I had a choice to make. Stay and tell the story, or run and save my life. You know what? I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. Because to understand what happened that day, you need to understand how I got there in the first place. You need to know what Saigon was like before the end, before everything changed forever. My name is contained in the memories of that war, and this is the story of the fall of Saigon as I lived it, as I witnessed it, as I barely survived it. I arrived in Saigon in March of 1973, fresh-faced, idealistic, completely unprepared. I'd been working for a mid-sized newspaper back in the States, covering city council meetings and the occasional house fire. Nothing that prepared me for war. But when my editor asked if anyone wanted to volunteer for the Saigon Bureau, my hand shot up before my brain could catch up. My colleagues thought I was crazy. My mother cried for 3 days straight. My girlfriend at the time, she just said, "If you get on that plane, don't bother coming back to me." I got on the plane anyway. See, I believed in something back then. I believed that journalism mattered, that telling the truth could change things, that if people just knew what was really happening, they'd care enough to make a difference. God, I was naive. But that naivety got me to Saigon, so maybe it served its purpose. The city hit me like a physical force the moment I stepped off that plane. The heat was oppressive, wrapping around you like a wet blanket you couldn't shake off. The smell was a mixture of fish sauce, gasoline, flowers, and something else. Something I couldn't quite identify at first. Later, I'd realize it was fear. You can smell fear in a city that knows it's living on borrowed time. But in those early days, Saigon seemed almost normal. The Paris Accords had been signed just 2 months earlier. American combat troops were withdrawing. There was this fragile, desperate hope in the air that maybe, just maybe, peace would hold. The streets were chaos in the best possible way. Motorbikes weaving through traffic in patterns that defied logic. Street vendors selling pho and banh mi on every corner. Beautiful French colonial buildings standing alongside newer, uglier structures. Kids playing soccer in the streets. Women in ao dais gliding past American GIs, stumbling out of bars. It was beautiful and broken and alive. I rented a small apartment in District 1, close to the Continental Hotel where most of the Foreign Press Corps hung out. My landlady was a widow named Mrs. Nguyen who spoke broken English and made the best K-pho I've ever tasted. She had 3 children and a photograph of her husband in uniform on the mantel. He died in 1968. Tet offensive. She never talked about it. Those first few months, I threw myself into work. I covered everything. Political maneuvering in the presidential palace, economic struggles as inflation spiraled, human interest stories about families divided by war. I interviewed ARVN soldiers, American advisors, refugees from the countryside. I was building sources, learning the language, starting to understand the complex, messy reality of a country that had known nothing but war for 3 decades. And I was falling in love with it, with Saigon, with Vietnam, with the resilience of people who kept living, kept hoping, even when everything seemed hopeless. I met other journalists, of course. We formed this strange little community, competing for stories during the day, drinking together at night, sharing tips, sources, war stories. We were young, most of us, ambitious, convinced we were doing important work. There was Sarah, a photographer from London with a death wish and the best eye for composition I'd ever seen. Mike, a wire service reporter from Texas who could drink anyone under the table and somehow still file clean copy at 3 in the morning. Jean-Claude, a French correspondent who'd covered the war since the 60s and had seen things that haunted his eyes. And there was Lynn, Lynn was my translator, though that word doesn't do her justice. She was my guide, my cultural interpreter, my friend. She was 24, brilliant, educated at the university before the war made that impossible. She spoke 4 languages and had a way of getting people to talk, to trust us with their stories. She also had family in Hanoi. Her sister had gone north in '54, one of the thousands who chose the communist side during the partition. They hadn't spoken in 20 years. "You Americans," she told me one day over coffee, "you think this is about ideology. Capitalism versus communism, democracy versus totalitarianism. Isn't it?" I asked. She smiled, sad and knowing. "It's about brothers killing brothers, families torn apart. It's about being so tired of war that you don't even remember what peace feels like." I should have listened to her more carefully, should have understood what she was really telling me. 1973 turned into 1974. The Paris Accords were supposed to bring peace. Instead, they just changed the nature of the fighting. North Vietnamese forces were supposed to withdraw. They didn't. The ceasefire was supposed to hold. It didn't. But for a while, Saigon felt insulated from it all. The war was happening out there, in the countryside, in the Central Highlands, in places with names that would later become infamous. An Loc, Xuan Loc, Phuoc Long. In Saigon, life went on. I settled into a routine. Morning coffee at a cafe near my apartment, reading Vietnamese newspapers with Lynn's help. Afternoons tracking down leads, conducting interviews, visiting government offices. Evenings writing, filing stories, meeting sources in quiet restaurants or noisy bars. I got better at my job. Started seeing past the official statements and propaganda to the truth underneath. Started building a network of contacts who would talk to me off the record. A colonel in the ARVN who was deeply pessimistic about their chances. A North Vietnamese sympathizer who worked in the presidential palace. A CIA officer who drank too much and talked too freely. The stories I was filing were getting darker. Corruption in the South Vietnamese government was rampant. Morale in the ARVN was crumbling. American aid was drying up as Congress grew tired of supporting an endless war. The North Vietnamese were rebuilding their forces, preparing for something big. But my editors back home, they were losing interest. Vietnam was old news. The American public had moved on. They wanted stories about Watergate, about the oil crisis, about anything other than a war they were trying to forget. I'd file these carefully researched pieces about the deteriorating situation, and they'd get buried on page 12, or cut down to a few paragraphs, or killed entirely. It was frustrating, infuriating. But I kept at it, because I could see what was coming. In early 1975, the North Vietnamese launched a major offensive in the Central Highlands. Phuoc Long province fell in January. It was the first time they'd captured and held a provincial capital. The South Vietnamese government barely reacted. The Americans didn't react at all. That's when I knew. I remember sitting with Jean-Claude at the Continental, watching the sun set over the city. He was on his 3rd whiskey, smoking one of those horrible French cigarettes he loved. "It's over," he said quietly. "They've decided to let it fall." "Who has?" "The Americans. They're not coming back. No matter what happens, they're not coming back." "What about the people here?" I asked. "What about everyone who believed in the promises?" He just looked at me with those haunted eyes and took another drink. By March, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The North Vietnamese captured Ban Mi Thuot in the Central Highlands. President Thieu ordered a withdrawal from the highlands to consolidate forces around Saigon. It was a disaster. The retreat became a rout. RVN soldiers abandoned their positions, their equipment, their weapons. Refugees flooded south, clogging the roads, making organized defense impossible. Entire provinces fell in days. Hue fell. Da Nang fell. The end was coming, faster than anyone had predicted, and Saigon was starting to wake up to it. April 1975. You could feel the panic setting in. It started subtle. Small things. The price of gold skyrocketing as people tried to convert their money into something portable. Lines at the passport office that stretched around the block. RVN officers quietly sending their families south, to the Delta, anywhere that might be safer. The American embassy started burning documents. You could see the smoke rising from the compound, thick black plumes that hung over the city like a funeral shroud. Foreign journalists started leaving, not all at once, but steadily. Sarah left in early April, after a close call in Xuan Loc left her with shrapnel in her leg and nightmares she couldn't shake. Mike got recalled by his wire service. Jean-Claude stayed. "I was here at the beginning," he told me. "I'll be here at the end." I stayed too. How could I leave? This was the story of a lifetime, the fall of a nation, the end of a 30-year war. I had to see it through, had to document it, had to bear witness. That's what I told myself anyway. The truth was more complicated. I stayed because I couldn't abandon the people I'd come to know, Mrs. Nguyen and her children, Lynn and her family, the sources who'd trusted me with their stories, the friends I'd made. How do you just leave people behind? The refugees were streaming into Saigon now, hundreds of thousands of them. They'd lost everything, their homes, their possessions, sometimes their families. They set up makeshift camps in parks, on sidewalks, anywhere they could find space. The city was bursting at the seams. I spent my days documenting it all, interviewing refugees about what they'd seen, talking to government officials who insisted everything was under control, even as the world collapsed around them, photographing the chaos because Sarah was gone and someone needed to capture this. The nights were worse. You could hear the artillery now, distant thunder that was getting closer every day. Sometimes rockets would hit the outskirts of the city. The North Vietnamese were tightening the noose. I'd lie awake in my apartment, listening to Mrs. Nguyen cry softly in her room, wondering what I was doing, wondering if I was going to die here. On April 21st, President Thieu resigned in a rambling, bitter speech that blamed everyone but himself for the defeat. He fled to Taiwan days later, reportedly with millions of dollars in gold. The new president, Tran Van Huong, lasted a week. Then came Duong Van Minh, Big Min, who'd been president briefly in 1963 after the coup against Diem. He was supposed to negotiate a peaceful surrender. It was all theater by this point. Everyone knew it. The Americans were evacuating. Operation Frequent Wind, they called it. The largest helicopter evacuation in history. Starting on April the 29th, they began pulling Americans and designated Vietnamese out of the country. The signal for the evacuation was both mundane and surreal. The temperature in Saigon is 105 degrees and rising, broadcast on Armed Forces Radio, followed by Bing Crosby's White Christmas. In the middle of a Vietnamese April, White Christmas played on repeat as a city fell apart. I'll never forget that. April 29th, 1975. I woke up to the sound of explosions. The North Vietnamese were shelling Tan Son Nut Airport. The main runway was damaged. The fixed-wing evacuation flights that had been ferrying people out were grounded. It was helicopters only now. I grabbed my camera, my notebook, and headed out into the chaos. The streets were pandemonium. Everyone who had any connection to the Americans, anyone who'd worked with them, anyone who feared what would happen when the North Vietnamese arrived, they were all trying to get to the evacuation points. The American embassy was a fortress under siege. Thousands of people pressed against the walls, waving documents, shouting, pleading. Marines in full combat gear stood guard, letting in only those with the right paperwork, the right connections. I saw families torn apart. Fathers with American approval papers going through while their brothers and cousins were turned away. Women holding babies, begging for mercy. Old men who'd worked for the Americans for decades, denied entry because their names weren't on the right list. It was heartbreaking. It was infuriating. It was everything wrong about how this war had been fought, distilled into one horrible day. I moved through the crowd, documenting it, taking photos, scribbling notes, interviewing people who were being left behind. A South Vietnamese colonel, still in uniform, told me, "They promised us. The Americans promised they would stand with us. Where are they now?" What could I say to that? I found Lynn around noon. She was with her family, her mother, her younger brother, an uncle. They were trying to get to the embassy, but they didn't have the right papers. "You have to help us," she said. The desperation in her eyes killed me. I tried. God, I tried. I called in every favor I had, contacted every American official I knew, argued, pleaded, demanded. But there were too many people and not enough helicopters. Not enough time. The bureaucracy that had strangled the war effort was now strangling the evacuation. Her family didn't get through. "You should go," Lynn told me in the late afternoon. "You're American. You can still get out." "I'm not leaving," I said. "Don't be stupid," she said, and I could hear the anger mixing with fear. "What good does it do for you to die here? I'm a journalist. I need to document this." She grabbed my arm, hard enough to hurt. "You want to document it? Fine, then survive. Live to tell the story. Don't waste your life on some romantic notion of dying for the truth." I didn't know what to say to that. We stood there in the chaos, two people who'd spent 2 years working together, becoming friends, and now facing the end. "If you survive this," I told her, "find me. When it's over, when things settle down, find a way to contact me. I'll help you get out." She smiled, sad and knowing. "You Americans, always making promises." Then she kissed my cheek and disappeared into the crowd with her family. I never saw her again. By evening on April 29th, I'd made my way to the American embassy. The scene there was beyond description. Helicopters were coming in waves now, landing on the roof, on a pad in the courtyard. CH-46C Knights and CH-53C Stallions, their rotors creating hurricane-force winds that knocked people over, sent debris flying. Marines were pushing back the crowds, trying to maintain some kind of order, but there were too many people, too much desperation. I saw a Vietnamese man throw his children over the embassy wall. The Marines caught them, looked around for the parents, but they'd already been swallowed by the crowd. I saw fist fights breaking out as people fought for position. I saw Americans slipping Vietnamese friends through side doors. I saw thousands being left behind, and I saw the money. American dollars, Vietnamese piastres scattered on the ground. People had brought their life savings, thinking they could buy their way out. Now they were dropping it because survival mattered more than money. I was taking photos when a Marine grabbed my arm. "You American?" he shouted over the noise of the helicopters. "Yeah, press. You need to get out now. This is the last wave. I'm staying to cover the story." He looked at me like I was insane. Maybe I was. "Your funeral, buddy," he said, and moved on to help load another helicopter. I had a choice in that moment. I could have gotten on one of those helicopters, could have saved myself, could have gone home, filed my stories, moved on to the next assignment. But something kept me there. Was it dedication to the story? A sense of duty? Or was it guilt? Guilt about all the people who couldn't leave, about Lynn and her family, about Mrs. Nguyen and her children, about the colonel who'd asked where the Americans were. I don't know. I stayed. Around midnight, I was on a rooftop near the embassy with a small group of other journalists who'd made the same insane decision. We watched the helicopters coming and going, watched the last Americans and Vietnamese lifting off into the night sky. Jean-Claude was there, still smoking his terrible cigarettes. "You know what's funny?" he said. "In 1954, I watched the French leave Hanoi. I thought that was the end, but it was just the beginning. 21 more years of war. What do you think happens now?" I asked. "Now?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Now we see what peace looks like. I'm not sure it will be any better than war. We watched the last helicopter lift off from the embassy roof at 7:53 a.m. on April 30th. It carried Ambassador Graham Martin and the last of the Marine Guards. The American war in Vietnam was over. Dawn on April 30th, 1975. Saigon woke up to a strange, surreal quiet. The helicopters were gone. The shelling had stopped. For the first time in as long as anyone could remember, there was no sound of war. But the quiet felt wrong. Ominous, like the moment before a storm breaks. I was exhausted, running on adrenaline and coffee. I hadn't slept in over 30 hours. But there was no way I could sleep now. Not when history was happening. I made my way through the empty streets toward the presidential palace. A few other journalists were doing the same. We didn't talk much. What was there to say? The city felt abandoned. Most South Vietnamese soldiers had shed their uniforms, desperate not to be identified as ARVN. You'd see military uniforms and boots discarded on street corners, evidence of men running for their lives. Some ARVN soldiers were still fighting. There were scattered firefights in some districts, holdouts who couldn't accept the inevitable. But it was disorganized, hopeless. Around 10:30 a.m., we saw them. The North Vietnamese army, tanks rolling down the wide boulevards of Saigon. T-54s and T-55s, Soviet-made, unstoppable. Infantry soldiers riding on top, young men in pith helmets and green uniforms, many of them looking as stunned as we felt. They'd been fighting for this moment for decades. Some of them had been fighting their entire adult lives. And now, here they were, conquering Saigon. I took photos, lots of photos. My hands were shaking, but I kept shooting. At 11:30 a.m., a tank crashed through the gates of the presidential palace. A North Vietnamese soldier jumped down and ran to raise the Viet Cong flag over the building. President Duong Van Minh, who'd been president for exactly 2 days, surrendered unconditionally. "The war's over," he announced. And just like that, it was. 30 years of conflict, millions of dead, a country torn apart, traumatized, devastated. Over. I stood there in the street, watching the North Vietnamese soldiers secure the palace, and I felt numb. This was the story I'd stayed for, the moment of history I'd risked my life to witness. I should have felt something. Triumph, maybe. The vindication of a journalist who'd stayed when others left. But all I felt was hollow, because I knew this wasn't really an ending. It was just a new beginning, and for millions of Vietnamese people, the suffering wasn't over. In some ways, it was just starting. Those first days after the fall were strange beyond description. The North Vietnamese soldiers who'd taken the city were mostly young, disciplined, almost polite. They'd been warned not to loot, not to abuse the population, and for the most part, they didn't. But there was an atmosphere of uncertainty. Fear. Nobody knew what would happen next. Would there be reprisals? Mass executions? The communists had a reputation, deserved or not, for brutality. The foreign journalists who'd stayed were rounded up and taken to the Continental Hotel. We weren't arrested exactly. But we weren't free to leave either. They kept us there for days while they figured out what to do with us. I spent that time interviewing other journalists, sharing notes, trying to piece together what was happening in the rest of the city. We heard rumors, some true, some false. It was hard to know what to believe. Former South Vietnamese officials were being arrested. Anyone with connections to the old regime was being investigated. Re-education camps were being set up. Re-education. Such a pleasant word for something so terrible. I thought about Lynn constantly. Was she safe? Had her family been targeted? I had no way to find out. Mrs. Nguyen's apartment was in a different district. I couldn't go check on her, couldn't do anything. That was the worst part, the helplessness. After 5 days, they told us we could leave. They'd arranged flights out through Hanoi, We were being expelled from the country. I didn't want to go. I still had work to do, stories to tell, but I didn't have a choice. On May 5th, 1975, I boarded a flight from Hanoi to Bangkok. Looking down at Vietnam from the air, I wondered if I'd ever see it again. The next year was a blur. I was briefly famous, the journalist who'd stayed for the fall. I did interviews, gave talks, published articles. My editor was thrilled. I'd gotten the story of a lifetime, but I couldn't shake the guilt. I'd gotten out. I was safe. Back in the States. Back to comfortable life. Back to normalcy. Lynn hadn't gotten out. Mrs. Nguyen hadn't gotten out. The colonel, the sources, the friends. They were all still there, living under a regime that saw them as enemies or collaborators. The refugee crisis was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese fled the country in the months and years after the fall. The boat people, they were called. Packed into overcrowded, unseaworthy vessels, risking everything for a chance at freedom. Many died at sea, drowned in storms, killed by pirates, lost in the vast Pacific. I tried to help. I sponsored refugee families, donated money to resettlement organizations, volunteered with groups helping new arrivals adjust to life in America. It wasn't enough. It was never enough, but it was something. I kept working as a journalist, covered other stories, other wars, other tragedies, but Vietnam stayed with me. It marked me in ways I'm still discovering. For years, I had nightmares. The sound of helicopters would make my heart race. I'd see Lynn's face in crowds and then realize it wasn't her, could never be her. I went to therapy. It helped, some. But some wounds don't heal. They just become part of who you are. 20 years later, I went back. Vietnam had changed. The war with China in 1979, the occupation of Cambodia, the economic struggles of the 80s, and then, slowly, opening up. Doi Moi, they called it, renovation, economic reforms. By 1995, the US and Vietnam had normalized relations. It was possible to visit as a journalist again. I had to go back, had to see it with my own eyes. Saigon, officially Ho Chi Minh City now, though locals still called it Saigon, was unrecognizable. The street I'd lived on was still there, but completely transformed. New buildings everywhere. Motorbikes still dominated the traffic, but there were more of them. The economy was growing. Young people who'd been born after the war were building new lives. The Continental Hotel was still standing, still operating. I had a drink there, just like old times, though none of my old colleagues were around. I tried to find Mrs. Nguyen. Her apartment building was gone, replaced by a modern high-rise. I asked around the neighborhood, but nobody remembered her. 20 years is a long time. I tried to find Lynn. I hired a local researcher, checked records, asked everyone I could. Nothing. She'd vanished, whether she'd died, fled the country, or just wanted to forget her past association with an American journalist, I don't know. I'll never know, but I did find one person, the colonel, the ARVN officer who'd asked where the Americans were that terrible day at the embassy. He'd spent 12 years in a re-education camp. Brutal, dehumanizing years. When he was released, he couldn't find work, couldn't leave the country, was marked as a former enemy. We met at a small cafe in District 1. He was 60 now, looked 80. The war in the camps had broken something in him. "Why did you come back?" he asked me. "I needed to see it," I said. "Needed to know what happened. To the people I knew, to the city." He nodded slowly. "You want to know what happened?" We lost everything. Our country, our families, our futures, and the world moved on. Forgot about us. "I didn't forget," I said. "No." He smiled, but it was bitter. "Then why did it take you 20 years to come back?" I didn't have an answer for that. We talked for 2 hours. He told me about the camps, about the men who didn't survive, about trying to rebuild a life in a country that saw him as a traitor. At the end, I gave him an envelope. Money. Not much, but more than I could really afford. He took it, looked at it, and handed it back. "I don't need your charity," he said. "I just needed someone to remember, to acknowledge what we went through, that we existed, that we mattered." "You did matter," I said. "You do matter." He stood up to leave. "Tell the story," he said. "That's what you do, right? Tell stories. So tell ours. Tell the truth about what happened here. Don't let us be forgotten." Then he walked out of the cafe and disappeared into the crowded Saigon street. I never saw him again either. It's been 50 years now since the fall of Saigon, half a century. Most of the people who lived through it are dead now. The Vietnam War is history, ancient history to young people today, as remote to them as World War II was to me when I was their age. But for those of us who were there, it's still immediate, still real. I think about it all the time, about the choices I made, the people I left behind, the stories I told and the ones I couldn't tell. Was I right to stay? Was I right to leave when I did? Should I have done more to help Lin, Mrs. Nguyen, all the others? I don't know. What I do know is this: witnessing history comes with a cost. You can't see human suffering on that scale and remain unchanged. You can't watch a country collapse, watch people's lives destroyed, watch children separated from their parents, and not carry that with you forever. But there's also a responsibility. If you witness history, if you survive when others don't, you have an obligation to tell the story, to make sure people remember, to ensure that the dead, the missing, the forgotten are acknowledged. That's what I've tried to do. I wrote a book about my experiences. It did okay. Some people read it, some people cared. But I wonder sometimes if anyone really understands, if anyone who wasn't there can truly grasp what it was like. The terror, the chaos, the heartbreak, the smell of a city dying, the sound of helicopters fleeing into the night, the faces of people being left behind. What did Vietnam teach me? It taught me that war is never clean, never simple, never really ends even when the fighting stops. It taught me that governments lie, that politicians will sacrifice anyone and anything for political gain, that ordinary people pay the price for their leaders' mistakes. It taught me that journalism matters, but it's not enough. That bearing witness is important, but it doesn't stop bad things from happening. It taught me about the resilience of the human spirit. I saw people who'd lost everything find reasons to keep living, saw kindness in the middle of horror, saw hope in impossible circumstances. It taught me about guilt, about how you can do everything right and still feel like you failed. It taught me that choosing to leave is not the same as abandoning, that survival is not betrayal, that you can't help anyone if you're dead. But it also taught me that some debts can never be repaid. The people who helped me, who trusted me, who told me their stories, I owe them. I owe them the truth. I owe them remembrance. That's why I'm telling this story now. Not because I'm proud of my role in it. Not because I think I'm a hero. I'm not. I'm just someone who was there, who saw it, who survived, and who refuses to let it be forgotten. If you visit Vietnam today, you'll find a vibrant, dynamic country. Ho Chi Minh City is booming. Skyscrapers, shopping malls, coffee shops on every corner. The economy is growing. Young people are connected to the world through smartphones and social media. In many ways, it's unrecognizable from the Saigon I knew. But if you know where to look, you can still see the scars. The War Remnants Museum shows the brutality of the conflict, though from a decidedly one-sided perspective. The Reunification Palace, the old presidential palace, still has the tanks that crashed through its gates on display. And if you talk to older Vietnamese people, the ones who remember, you'll find the war is still there, in their memories, in their losses, in the family members who never came home, from either side. The thing about history is that it doesn't really end. It just becomes part of the present. The fall of Saigon wasn't just one day in 1975. It's every day since. It's every refugee who rebuilt their life in a new country. It's every family still divided between Vietnam and the diaspora. It's every person still carrying trauma from those years. It's every journalist who tries to tell the truth about war and wonders if anyone's listening. Over the years, Vietnam has been depicted in countless movies, books, documentaries. Some of them get it right, some of them don't. The best ones capture the confusion, the moral ambiguity, the sense that everyone was trapped in something larger than themselves, making impossible choices. The worst ones turn it into entertainment, into action movie spectacle, into political propaganda from one side or the other. What gets lost sometimes is the individual human cost. The farmer who just wanted to work his rice paddy and got caught between two armies. The South Vietnamese soldier fighting for a corrupt government because it was still his country. The North Vietnamese soldier who believed in the cause but had to do terrible things in its name. The mother who had to choose which children to save when there wasn't room in the boat for all of them. These are the stories that matter. Not the geopolitics, not the military strategy, not the political debates, the human stories. That's what I tried to capture. That's what I'm still trying to capture. I should talk about my colleagues, the other journalists who covered the war. Some of them became famous. Won Pulitzers, wrote best-selling books, built careers on their Vietnam reporting. Some of them were killed, died covering battles, stepping on landmines, getting caught in crossfire. Some of them came home broken, couldn't shake what they'd seen, struggled with PTSD, alcoholism, failed relationships, and some of them just moved on, filed their stories and went to the next assignment, treated it like a job, which maybe was the healthiest approach. I think about a conversation I had with an older war correspondent early in my time in Vietnam. He'd covered World War II, Korea, and now this. "The thing they don't tell you," he said, "is that you can't unsee things. Once you've seen what war really is, what it does to people, you carry that forever." He was right. I've seen things I wish I could forget. Bodies in the street, children with burns from napalm, soldiers, barely more than kids, dying in agony. The desperation in people's eyes as they begged for help I couldn't give. These images are burned into my memory. I can close my eyes and see them as clearly as if they happened yesterday, and I'm one of the lucky ones. I got to leave. I got to go home. The people who lived through it, who had no choice, no escape, they carried even more. Here's something I've struggled with for 50 years. Were we, the journalists, complicit? We documented the war. We told the American public what was happening. We showed them the cost in blood and treasure, and we're often credited with turning public opinion against the war, with helping end it. But did we also enable it by making it dramatic, compelling, newsworthy? Did we turn suffering into entertainment? Did we reduce complex human tragedies to headline-grabbing stories? There's a famous photograph from Vietnam. You probably know it. A South Vietnamese general executing a Viet Cong prisoner in the street, point-blank shot to the head. That photograph won a Pulitzer Prize. It shocked the American public. It became an iconic image of the war's brutality. But the photographer later said he regretted taking it. Not because it wasn't newsworthy, but because it defined that general who just witnessed the murder of his men's families as a monster without context. One moment, one photograph, and the man's entire life was reduced to that. Is that journalism, or is it something else? I don't know. What I do know is that every photograph I took, every story I wrote, reduced complex human beings to characters in a narrative. Simplified motivations, created heroes and villains. Because that's what stories do. They simplify. They create meaning out of chaos. But real life isn't a story. Real people aren't characters. They're complicated and contradictory and human. And sometimes I wonder if, in trying to tell the truth, we actually obscured it. Let me tell you what happened to some of the people who couldn't leave. After the fall, the new government rounded up anyone associated with the old regime. Former soldiers, police officers, government officials, journalists who'd worked for Western press. They were sent to re-education camps. Re-education sounds benign. It wasn't. These were forced labor camps. Prisoners worked in harsh conditions, were given minimal food, subjected to political indoctrination sessions for hours each day. The lucky ones spent a few months there. Others stayed for years. Some never came out. The camps were supposed to reform people, to turn them into good communist citizens. What they actually did was break people, destroy them physically and psychologically. And it wasn't just the prisoners who suffered. Their families were marked, blacklisted, denied education, jobs, opportunities. Children were punished for their parents' choices. Then there were the boat people. Starting in the late 70s and continuing through the 80s, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese fled by sea. They packed into overcrowded fishing boats and set out into the South China Sea, hoping to reach Thailand, Malaysia, anywhere. Many didn't make it. Boats sank in storms. Pirates attacked, robbing, raping, murdering. People died of dehydration, starvation, exposure. The estimated death toll is somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 people. Think about that. 250,000 to 500,000 people who survived the war only to die trying to escape the peace. Those who made it to refugee camps faced years of uncertainty, cramped conditions, disease, despair. Eventually, many were resettled in the United States, France, Australia, Canada. They built new lives, learned new languages, adapted to new cultures, but they never forgot. The Vietnamese diaspora carries the memory of the fall, of the escape, of everything lost. It's passed down to their children and grandchildren. Second and third generation Vietnamese Americans who've never seen Vietnam still feel connected to that history. That's the thing about trauma. It echoes through generations. I've spent 50 years thinking about counterfactuals. What if the US had kept its promises to South Vietnam? What if Congress had approved the military aid President Ford requested in early 1975? What if the Paris Accords had been enforced? What if there had been real international oversight? What if we'd evacuated more people? What if we'd started earlier, moved faster, been more organized? What if we'd never gone to Vietnam in the first place? These questions haunt me. Because the truth is, the fall of Saigon didn't have to happen the way it did. Choices were made, policies were implemented, actions were taken or not taken, and millions of people paid the price for those decisions. I'm not naive enough to think there were easy answers. Vietnam was complicated. The geopolitics were complex. There were no perfect solutions, but there were better options than what happened. We could have evacuated more people. We could have honored our commitments. We could have managed the collapse in a way that caused less suffering. We didn't. And that's on us. On the United States. On the politicians who made promises they didn't keep. On the military planners who prepared for everything except actual defeat. On people like me, too. Journalists who told stories but couldn't change outcomes. The Vietnam War cast a long shadow over American foreign policy. For a generation, another Vietnam was the nightmare scenario, the thing to avoid at all costs. It made Americans skeptical of military intervention, wary of quagmires, demanding of exit strategies. The Vietnam Syndrome, they called it. And for a while, it worked. It made us more careful, more reluctant to commit troops to uncertain conflicts. But memories fade. Iraq, Afghanistan. We went in with different justifications, different strategies, but some of the same patterns emerged. Initial success followed by grinding insurgency, promises of nation-building that never quite materialized, growing domestic opposition, difficult, chaotic withdrawals, different wars, different contexts, but echoes of Vietnam. Because the fundamental lesson of Vietnam, that military force alone cannot solve complex political and social problems, is one we keep forgetting, or maybe we remember but don't care. I watched the fall of Kabul in August 2021, saw the helicopters evacuating the embassy, saw the desperate crowds at the airport, saw people clinging to planes, falling to their deaths, and I couldn't help but see Saigon. Different country, different war, different generation. Same mistakes, same chaos, same people left behind. It made me angry. It made me sad. Mostly, it made me wonder what the point of remembering history is if we don't learn from it. Let me get personal for a moment. Vietnam cost me. It cost me relationships. My girlfriend who told me not to get on the plane was right. We never got back together. I've been married twice since then. Both marriages ended in divorce. Both times, Vietnam was part of the problem. How do you maintain intimacy when there's this huge part of your life, this defining experience that your partner can't understand? When nightmares wake you up screaming, when you can't be in crowds because they make you anxious, when the sound of fireworks sends you into a panic. It cost me my innocence. That idealistic young journalist who thought telling the truth mattered. He died in Saigon. What replaced him was someone more cynical, more aware of how little one person can do, how little stories matter when faced with the machinery of war and politics. It cost me my sense of safety. After Vietnam, I never felt truly safe again. There was always this awareness that everything could collapse, that the comfortable life we take for granted could vanish in an instant. It cost me friendships. Some of my colleagues from Saigon couldn't cope, couldn't adjust to normal life, turned to alcohol or drugs. Some committed suicide. Jean-Claude died in 1982. Officially, it was a heart attack. But I think Vietnam killed him, just slowly. And it cost me Lynn. Not just her physical presence, but the uncertainty. Not knowing what happened to her, whether she's alive or dead, whether she thinks about our time working together or has forgotten me entirely. That not knowing is its own kind of torture. So why does this matter? Why tell this story now, 50 years later? Because memory is how we honor the dead. Because if we forget what happened, we risk repeating it. Because the people who lived through it, who suffered through it, deserve to have their experiences acknowledged. Because the fall of Saigon wasn't just a historical event, it was millions of individual tragedies. Each person has a story, each story matters, and because we're still living with the consequences, the Vietnamese diaspora, the veterans still struggling with PTSD, the children of war, now in their 50s and 60s, still processing trauma, the political divisions in America over military intervention, the skepticism about government promises, the awareness that wars are easier to start than to finish. All of this traces back to Vietnam, to that day in April 1975 when helicopters fled a falling city, when promises were broken, when people were abandoned, when a 30-year war finally, brutally, ended. If you take nothing else from this, understand this. War is not abstract. It's not statistics or strategy or political ideology. It's individual human beings, each with their own life, their own family, their own hopes and dreams. Each one matters. The ARVN soldier who fought for years and ended up in a re-education camp, he matters. The North Vietnamese soldier who believed in his cause and sacrificed everything for it, he matters. The refugee who drowned at sea trying to escape, she matters. The child orphaned by the war, they matter. Lynn matters. Mrs. Nguyen matters. The Colonel matters. They're not just supporting characters in America's story about Vietnam. They're the main characters in their own stories, stories that were shaped and often destroyed by decisions made in Washington and Hanoi. And here's the thing, most of them never wanted to be part of history. They didn't choose to be caught up in a war that devastated their country. They just wanted normal lives, to raise their families, to work their jobs, to live in peace. The war took that from them, and when the war ended, the chaos of the fall took even more. So when you think about Vietnam, when you see the images of helicopters and crowds and panic, remember, those aren't just images. They're people. Real people who suffered real consequences, and many of them are still alive, still carrying those memories, still living with what was done to them and their country. They deserve to be remembered. If you're watching this and you're a Vietnam veteran, from either side, I see you. I know you came home to a country that didn't want to hear about the war. That was uncomfortable with your service, that sometimes treated you like the war was your fault. You deserved better. If you're a Vietnamese refugee, someone who escaped and built a new life in a new country, I see your strength. I know it wasn't easy. I know you lost things you can never get back. I know you carry pain that never fully heals. You are remarkable. If you're a child of the war, born in Vietnam during those years, or born to refugees after, I see how the war shaped your life even if you don't remember it directly. You inherited a trauma that wasn't yours, but became yours anyway. That's not fair, but you're here. You survived, and that means something. And if you're someone who was left behind when Saigon fell, who lived through the aftermath, who endured the re-education camps and the hard years that followed, I'm sorry. I'm sorry we didn't do more. I'm sorry promises were broken. I'm sorry you suffered. Your suffering mattered. Your life matters. Your story deserves to be told. Here's what I've learned in 50 years. The fall of Saigon never really ended. It's still happening in the memories of those who lived it, in the trauma passed down through generations, in the political lessons learned and forgotten, in the scars on a country that has rebuilt but can never fully recover. That day, April 30th, 1975, was just one day. But it contained multitudes. It contained every decision that led to it, every battle fought, every life lost, every promise made and broken over 30 years. It contained the future too, the re-education camps and boat people and refugees, the normalization of relations and the slow rebuilding, the memory and the forgetting. All of it was there in that moment when the tanks crashed through the palace gates. I was there. I saw it. I documented it. But I've spent 50 years trying to understand it, and I'm still trying. Maybe that's the real lesson, that some events are so large, so traumatic, so complex that we can never fully grasp them. We can only bear witness. Tell the stories. Remember the names. Honor the dead. And try, as best we can, to learn something. To be better. To make choices that create less suffering. That's all we can do. So that's my story. The fall of Saigon as I lived it. It's not the complete story. No one person could tell that. There were millions of stories in that city, in that country, in that war. This is just mine. But it's true. Every word of it, the fear, the chaos, the impossible choices, the people left behind, the guilt I still carry. All true. I've told this story many times over the years, in articles, in speeches, in my book, and now to you. Each time I tell it, I hope it matters. I hope someone hears it and understands something they didn't before. I hope it makes the war real to someone who only knows it from history books. I hope it honors the memory of those who didn't survive to tell their own stories. Because that's what journalism is supposed to do, right? Bear witness. Tell the truth. Make people care. I still believe that, despite everything. I still believe that stories matter, that memory matters, that truth matters, even when it's painful, especially when it's painful. So I'll keep telling this story as long as I can, as long as anyone will listen. Because Lynn told me to survive and tell the story. Because the Colonel told me not to let them be forgotten. Because I owe it to everyone who didn't make it out. And because 50 years later, I'm still that 28-year-old journalist standing on a rooftop, watching helicopters flee into the night, trying to make sense of something that defies sense. Still trying to understand, still bearing witness, still remembering. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it helped you understand something about Vietnam or war or history or humanity, then share it. Talk about it. Keep the conversation going. Because memory is how we honor the past. and remembering is how we try to build a better future. Thank you for listening.